The joy of writing. It was a surprise, and not, to hear that singing releases endorphins. Church choir singing being proximate to me over a great part of my life, relations and friends partaking in the, to me, strange and, to me, vainglorious venture, the activity of singing before others solicited from me no positive opinion. People have told me that I have a good singing voice, but that was to me, who had always thought it a rather low kind of talent, no matter. I'd rather have my vainglory rest upon many another foundation, and yet now, fully immersed into my mature and fixed depression, the argumentum ad endorphin strikes me in a new way. It is to me a finer thing to sing because of the chemicals than because of the attention, though I'd care not to debate any great philosopher on the question. The matter of endorphins has also, more to the point, compelled me to think about my relationship with the pen, or the keyboard. It's not always easy to see facts when they're deeply immersed in a lifestyle, a career, a vocation, what have you. These kinds are often brushed against as a part of the general assessment. Was this day a good one or a bad one? Often, too, facts of this kind, having acted as pivot points in one's personal history, are rarely revisited on an abstract level. They simply become facts of life, background noise, the plot's setting. Likewise, the question, shall we have a baby, cannot be asked again after once having been answered in the affirmative. The word again would have to be added, and, once added, becomes an entirely new question, giving rise to entirely new facts. Similarly so for writing and the pleasure that it gives. It's like a medicine that serves its purpose and cannot be lived without. But, unlike medicine, we hardly ever think of writing as vital to one's life. It's the nature of this joy, the joy of writing, that I wish to describe. It seems to me that writing can be pleasurable to many, and is pleasurable to those who choose to do it for other than purely mercenary reasons, though we need not exclude these reasons entirely, for the simple reason that it is for people of this kind the best use of a specific natural faculty. All the organs of the body serve a purpose, and all the organs are tied to each other to sustain the life of the body in general and the purposes of each organ in particular, all for one and one for all. It might seem less obvious how the cells which power the growth of the large toenail are tied up with the good operation of the spleen, for example, but the poor condition of either one of these organs impacts the condition of the other. Such is the nature of our body's plumbing. The ill use or neglect of any organ harms it, and harming it specifically harms the whole body. The organ most obviously connected to writing is, of course, the brain. The brain is the most complex and thereby demanding organ of all. We know too little about it, though we know too little about the big toe as well. But among the list of things that we do know about the brain is that it is an organ of thought and must be employed accordingly in order for all of its vital plumbing to be maintained in a healthy state. We know there are substances and activities that can injure the brain, and we know there are substances and activities that can bring to it and keep it in health. The pleasure attached to the nurturing operation of the female breast is a clear indication of the rightness of that operation. A mother takes pleasure in the act of nursing. The pleasure of a particular kind of person can take in writing must, therefore, indicate something for that person. One must attend to the pleasure itself. When did it occur, and occur most strongly? I have a feeling that we might make general statements about writers in this regard, but also that there are kinds of writers, and, on the other hand, that there are unique writers. The general serves the specific too. Most importantly, writing gives rise to the kind of thinking that is precisely attuned to the writer's mind, its needs, and its pleasures. Writing is thinking, and it is a kind of thinking, an operation of the body that is particularly good at falling into those empty spots in the brain, the filling of which with blood or electricity or certain hormones enables it to perform its favorite actions. Joy is the response to the activation of these previously neglected spots, perhaps too long inactive, the activation amounting to nothing other than the kind of thinking that this brain loves. How is this experienced? How is this kind of thinking and this part or these parts of the brain distinct? I'm unable to answer this other than to point to the kind of writing the individual writer finds most satisfying. This may not admit of a single answer or to one description over the span of one's whole life. Let me speak in more concrete terms. A person might enjoy writing poetry, even a particular kind of poetry, at one point in one's life, and then prefer writing history at another. It may even be the case that he enjoys writing history the most only after having composed a stanza or two of poetry first. I think most writers can identify with the kind of thing I am describing here: habits, schedules, routines. In describing writing service to the brain's health, one may consider such differentiation by genre as beside the point, even a manifestation of nothing more than the author's vanity. It may be for some people, or in many cases. I'm not necessarily suggesting that when, how, and what we write should be dictated by spontaneity. Indeed, we might need to learn to curb our conscious willfulness and make it better heed the subtler promptings or clues of the brain. The brain speaks, but does the author listen? Has a writer done himself a disservice by turning himself into a certain kind of writer that is not his best kind? One cannot always ignore the external forces, such as an employer's bidding, but one ought to fall into the habit of asking himself about himself, and never fall out of this habit because of external forces. Moreover, one must attend to the force that is trendiness, for a certain trend or viewpoint may be inimical to his growth as a happy writer. Happy writing might not make a happy writer, but it can never stand in its way. As for unnatural practices, yes, after a while a bad shoe may fit, but will have caused some damage to the foot along the way. One ought never simply accept his unhappiness, and a writer deserves happiness as much as anyone else does. Subject matter and style aren't the only matters of relevance. Pace is important too, pace and timing. There are few great universal rules governing the when, the how, and the how much of writing. Alertness is one. One's biorhythms and metabolism are hard to pin down, though they need to be considered carefully. This is where writing is thinking really shines. Writing is a pace of thinking nearly perfectly suited to the human brain, at least the brains of those who are drawn to writing. There are some who excel in conversation, and this human capacity must in some way lie at the root of the arts of the stage and the dialectic. And yet it is worth noting that philosophical dialogues, for example, have almost never originated from actual conversations. We cannot say that no great speech has ever arisen purely extemporaneously, but we can state with certainty that the majority have not. I am certain that many great discoveries have come about through dialogue, though for the most part, no written record of these remain. Conversation between two great minds, or perhaps between a teacher and a student, have much in common with the kind of thinking that is writing. Some authors have made this rather plain by their use of the inner dialogue form, a conversation between the writer and reason, or between the writer and his genius, lady's philosophy, or some other figure of the past who serves as a manifestation of one of these practically supernatural powers. It should come as no surprise that pleasurable writing will progress in the form of a conversation. This is about as fast as the mind can work, as fast as it ought to be compelled to work. This is not a matter of how fast one writes a sentence, we should note. This is how fast the sentences take to assume their final form. Hardly any important sentence flows out at once altogether, as by its very nature any single thought contains a vast quantity of assertions and denials to which the author has given careful consideration. That is to say, he thinks carefully about what he wishes to stand behind and what he wishes not to say. This happens in a good conversation too, as when one's interlocutor is careful to ask about the speaker's precise intention. An author no more knows himself, all he wishes to affirm and to deny by a single statement than does the speaker. It takes time for him to think it through. A speaker takes as much pleasure in the rarefication of his thoughts through his interlocutor's aid as the private writer does in the careful selection of his prepositions, tenses, and vocabulary. For the latter, there is a particular joy in the sometimes arduous task of contemplating how the decision he makes about one element, say a preposition, impacts the viability of his other choices, i.e., which among the number of synonyms available to him then best approximates his meaning. Great writing consists first and foremost in these choices, that is to say, in his careful attentions to the implication, and only secondarily in the beauty of a construction. This is much the rule of poetry as it is for prose, as confusion has cost many a poem a portion of its strength. Of course, there are times when confusion is itself the point. I can think of Kierkegaard and Kafka as great examples of this. In this case, the confusion point needs to be carefully conveyed to the reader. Human thought is by its nature progressive. A better word for this is discursive, since progress seems to imply that thought inevitably marches towards truth. In fact, of itself, thought can only promise us greater clarity, not greater veracity. Indeed, it is so that elegant errors are far more interesting and admirable than confused truths. This is a wonderful thing for writers. We might hope that our movement towards greater consistency will move us towards truth itself, but we cannot depend upon this. And I say we need not depend upon it. There are many different conceptions of the truth, not only in terms of what the great long list of facts really includes, let us say its matter, but we also need to talk about the form of truth, by which I mean to ask whether the truth is primarily ethical, empirical, logical, fideistic, affective, aesthetic, etc. It seems to me that a writer's pleasure depends much more on his views about the latter than on the former, and his pleasure will, therefore, consist in the fidelity of his service to that form of truth that appears to him most important. For Socrates, it was the ethical. For Keats, it was the aesthetic. And for Kierkegaard, it was the fideistic. These are not irrelevant biographical details when it comes to the matter of the brain's best operation. For a man is the truth he seeks. And yet, the type of truth he recognizes as the most important kind, in his opinion, does not say everything about how he is made happy by writing. One might find himself an aesthete, for example, and yet consider the world a horror, and the pleasure and meaning that beauty supplies, as a matter of fact, insufficient to take pleasure in. Writing has power in itself, but making oneself sufficiently attentive to it in order to access its power is for some a matter of much labor. We must hope that this labor brings the goal within reach. We must hope. We can only hope that it does. This labor, spiritual, intellectual, moral habit forming, consists in the things I have so far mentioned in this essay and have yet to say. Can it be that the surest ways to harness the power of writing to make one happy lies paradoxically not in writing itself, but in some other activity first? That might be, at least in part, but the best illustration of the relationship between life and writing can be seen in the journal. Writing is a reflection of life, yes, but of the writer's internalizing of it. As I have said, one need not to write to find joy in his mind's right operation, but writing is particularly well suited to bringing this about. Whereas the unsettled mind flits about like an agitated animal, letters, words, and the instruments of their physical construction have another character altogether, one which serves to straighten out the chaos. Letters and words have arisen, not by the need of one frantic mind, but by the requirements of intercommunication, and are thereby more versatile and dispassionate than most brains on their own. The elements of writing, letters and words, are intrinsically dialogical. Writing, therefore, is essentially dialogical, and the act of writing is, first and foremost, a communication between the subconscious and conscious minds and among whatever else lies in between these two. The pace of writing is the pace of making one's meaning clear to oneself. It can operate no more quickly than that. Writing, then, requires one to become more aware of oneself. It may be objected that writing can never replace interpersonal communication. It may likewise be answered that neither can the impersonal replace the interpersonal. Good conversation always involves clarity, and clarity is never gained instantaneously. To the person who is drawn most to writing, the clarity he seeks he can only find through this interdialogue. One correctly timed, like any functional mechanism needs to be, through the formation of letters, words, and sentences. No matter one's education, genius, or experience, one is always the perfect interlocutor for oneself. It is, therefore, beyond no one's ability to discover himself through writing. Why it is that human beings take pleasure in discovery may have a greater religious, philosophical, or anthropological explanation than I am aware of. Here, I require nothing more than to think of the pleasure a squirrel must take in his discovery of a trove of acorns. I know only that that part of the brain of the writer that requires writing feels good when the person writes. It is its operation. Aristotle would rightly call this its final cause. That is to say, the purpose for which it was created. A person only seeks an answer, which is pondering on any matter whatsoever, by his personal self-originating desire. All questions are personal questions, because to ask is an act of the self. Questions arise from the self, from anxiety, curiosity, etc., only in a form that is possible for that person to produce, with an endpoint, an answer, defined, parameterized by the self. This endpoint not only possesses vocable content, surely a state more rudimentary than that which is formally or logically coherent per se, but moral status as well, one derived from the progenitor's self-conception, That is to say, from how its author considers it to stand in relation to his own sense of moral worth. Conceptions always have a moral character because good and evil, like, dislike, benefit, danger, are humanity's two most basic categories. Therefore, the essential difference between the conceptions of biological entities and those of artificial intelligences consists in the mortal anxiety intrinsic to any suitably complex biological entity, around which, and in service to which, his intelligence was developed over 1,000,000 generations. The kind of moral conception that I am describing here is as much a part of our experience of a clear blue sky, a smiling face, or a warming bonfire, as it is with anything that we might esteem in the lives of the saints or the writings of the Stoics. Or in other words, whether the truth we uncover from writing is positive, makes me feel good about myself and the world, or negative, the fact of discovery is itself positive, as the discovery has removed a certain vexatious mystery and, perhaps even more importantly, heightened my sense of my own powers. No matter one's ideology, like the squirrel, discovery has a connection to survival, and many discoveries do make me feel immortal.